In 1801, off the coast of Barcelona, a British warship captain named Thomas Cochrane spotted a massive vessel cutting through the morning haze. It was El Gamo, a 32-gun Xebec frigate of the Spanish Navy, carrying 319 sailors and enough firepower to sink a small fleet. Cochrane's ship, the HMS Speedy, had 14 guns and 54 men. The Speedy was so small that Cochrane once joked he could carry an entire broadside of cannonballs in his coat pockets. Any sane commander would have turned and run. Cochrane sailed straight toward it. What followed became one of the most famous single-ship actions in naval history. But the real story here is not Cochrane. The real story is that ship he was sailing toward, the Xebec, a vessel so fast, so agile, and so perfectly designed for violence that it terrorized the entire Mediterranean for over 2 centuries. Kingdoms paid millions in tribute just to avoid it. Entire coastlines were abandoned because of it, and over 1 million people were captured and enslaved by the pirates who sailed it. So how did one ship design become the most feared weapon on the water? To understand the Xebec, you have to go back to the Mediterranean in the 1600s. At that time, the Barbary Corsairs were already a serious problem. These were not your typical Hollywood pirates with parrots and treasure maps. The Corsairs were state-sponsored raiders operating out of the North African ports of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, all under the loose protection of the Ottoman Empire. Their local rulers handed out letters of marque, basically official permission slips to attack any ship that was not paying tribute, and their weapon of choice in the early days was the galley. Now, galleys had been the dominant warship in the Mediterranean since ancient Rome. Long, narrow, powered by banks of oars, they could move fast even when there was no wind. But they had a fatal weakness. When European nations started sending actual warships into the Mediterranean, ships with heavy cannons mounted along the sides, a galley was a floating coffin. One broadside from a French or Spanish frigate could tear a galley apart. The oars, the rowers, the thin hull, none of it could survive concentrated cannon fire, so the Corsairs had a problem. Their galleys were getting destroyed by European warships, but they still needed speed to chase down merchant ships and escape when things went sideways. They needed something new, and what they came up with was the Xebec. The name itself comes from the Arabic word shabak, meaning a small warship. But calling the Xebec small is misleading. What it really was a complete rethinking of how a pirate ship should work. The Corsair shipbuilders in Algiers and Tunis took the basic galley hull and started making changes. They widened the beam for stability. They removed most or all of the rowing benches to make room for cannons along the sides. And most importantly, they replaced the oar-dependent propulsion with 3 enormous lateen sails. These lateen sails were the secret weapon. Unlike the square sails used by most European ships, lateen sails are triangular, and they allowed the Xebec to do something almost no European vessel could match. It could sail close to the wind. Imagine you are a merchant captain on a heavy cargo ship, and you spot a pirate vessel behind you. Your only option is to sail with the wind at your back, because that is how square sails work best. But the Xebec does not care which direction the wind is blowing. Its lateen sails let it cut almost directly into the wind, meaning it could chase you from angles that were physically impossible for your ship to match. You could not outrun it. You could not outmaneuver it. Your only hope was to have bigger guns, and even that was not always enough. The lateen yards on a Xebec were absolutely massive. They were so large that each yard was actually 2 separate spars lashed together at the thicker ends to form one enormous beam. The foremast was typically raked forward, leaning out over the bow, while the main and mizzen masts stood straight or angled slightly back. The result was a sail plan that looked completely alien compared to anything sailing out of London or Lisbon, and it could outrun almost everything afloat. But speed was only part of the equation. The Xebec had another trick that made it perfect for piracy. It had an incredibly shallow draft, meaning the bottom of the hull barely dipped below the waterline. A European frigate might draw 15 or 20 feet of water. A Xebec could operate in waters barely deep enough to cover a man's chest. This meant Corsairs could hide in shallow coastal coves that no pursuing warship could enter. They could dart over reefs and sandbars that would rip the hull off anything chasing them, and they could approach beaches directly for raiding coastal villages, something a deep-drafted warship could never do. And if all of that was not enough, many Xebecs still carried oars as a backup. So, on a day when the wind died completely and a big European warship was sitting there like a cork in a bathtub, the Xebec could simply row right up to it, board it with hundreds of armed men, and take it without firing a single cannon. When used by Corsairs, a Xebec typically carried a crew of between 90 and 400 men. That is a lot of swords coming over the railing at once. The larger Xebecs mounted as many as 36 guns on the top deck. Depending on the caliber, that made them competitive with European sloops of war and even some frigates. They were not as heavily built as a proper warship. Thomas Jefferson himself once noted that Algerian Xebecs were so light they could not withstand the broadside of a good frigate. But the Corsairs did not want a stand-up fight. They wanted speed, surprise, and overwhelming numbers during boarding actions. And for that purpose, the Xebec was perfect. So, who were the pirates sailing these things? The Barbary Corsairs were not a ragtag bunch of outcasts. They were essentially the military arm of the North African regencies, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and to some extent, the Moroccan port of Sale. All functioned as pirate states. The local rulers, called Dees or Beys, took a cut of everything the Corsairs brought home. Captured ships, stolen cargo, and most valuable of all, captured people. And the Corsairs themselves were a wild mix. Some were born in North Africa and raised on the sea, but a surprising number were European renegades, men who had converted to Islam and switched sides because the money was simply better on the Corsair payroll. One of the most feared Corsairs in history was a Flemish sailor named Jan Janzoon, who reinvented himself as Murat Reis and rose to become an admiral of the Corsair fleet, operating out of Sale in Morocco. Before converting, he had been a Dutch privateer hunting Spanish ships during the 30 Years' War. After converting, he turned those same sailing skills and Atlantic navigation knowledge against everyone, Christian and otherwise. Then there were the Barbarossa brothers, Oruk and Hayreddin, Turkish-born sailors who became the most notorious Corsairs of the 16th century. They seized control of Algiers on behalf of the Ottoman Empire and turned it into the undisputed pirate capital of the Mediterranean. Hayreddin Barbarossa eventually became the Grand Admiral of the entire Ottoman Navy. And in 1538, he crushed a combined European fleet at the Battle of Preveza, securing Ottoman control over the eastern Mediterranean for decades. These were not petty criminals hiding in coves. These were military commanders running fleets of Xebecs and galleys with the full backing of sovereign states. Every Corsair captain, called a reis, typically commanded at least one Xebec of his own. The shipyards of Algiers alone were producing these vessels in enormous numbers, enough that rapid raiding expeditions could be launched across the entire sea at short notice. And then there was Sayyida al-Hurra, a Moroccan noblewoman who became known as the Pirate Queen of the Mediterranean. In the early 1500s, she set her own Corsair fleet against Spanish treasure ships as revenge for the fall of Granada. She ruled the port city of Tetuan and even married the Sultan of Morocco. Her name literally translates to the Free Woman, which tells you everything you need to know about her personality. The slave trade was the engine that powered the entire operation. Between 1500 and 1800, historians estimate that over 1 million European Christians were captured by Barbary Corsairs and sold into slavery in North Africa. That number comes from the work of historian Robert Davis, and while some scholars debate the exact figure, nobody disputes that the scale was enormous. During the first half of the 1600s alone, more than 20,000 Christian slaves were sold in the markets of Algiers. Men were typically put to work as galley rowers, chained to their oars until they died of exhaustion. Women and children faced their own horrors. The wealthy could sometimes arrange ransom through religious orders that specialized in negotiating with the Corsairs, but the poor had almost no chance of ever seeing home again. The economics of all this were staggering. Many European governments found it genuinely cheaper to pay annual tribute to the Barbary states than to fight them. England paid tribute. France paid tribute. The Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, all of them handed over gold, weapons, and naval supplies to keep the Corsairs from attacking their merchant fleets. It was a protection racket on an international scale, and the Xebec was the enforcement tool that kept everyone paying up. And the Corsairs did not limit themselves to attacking ships at sea. Using their Xebecs, which could approach shorelines that deeper vessels could not reach, they launched raids directly on coastal towns across southern Europe. Italian fishing villages, Spanish port towns, French coastal settlements, all lived in constant fear. In 1554, Corsairs attacked the Italian town of Vieste and slaughtered or enslaved thousands of people in a single raid. The narrow, winding streets you see in so many charming Mediterranean villages today, those were not built for aesthetics. They were designed to slow down raiders and give the locals time to escape or hide. Entire populations abandoned the coastline altogether. For centuries, nobody with any sense actually lived on the beach in the Mediterranean. You built your town on a hilltop, behind walls, and you posted lookouts in stone watchtowers along the shore. Hundreds of those watchtowers still stand today along the coasts of Italy, Spain, and southern France, each one built for the sole purpose of spotting the distinctive lateen sails of an approaching Xebec and ringing the alarm bell. But the Corsairs pushed even further than the Mediterranean. In June of 1631, Murat Reis sailed a fleet all the way to the coast of Ireland. He landed at a tiny fishing village called Baltimore in County Cork, and his men stormed ashore in the middle of the night. They kidnapped nearly the entire population, around 107 men, women, and children. Those people were dragged from their beds, marched to the beach, loaded onto the Corsair ships, and taken back to Algiers, where they were sold in the slave markets. Out of all those captured, only 3 ever saw Ireland again. The rest lived and died as slaves in North Africa, thousands of miles from the green hills where they were born. That raid on Baltimore was not even the most distant Corsair attack. In 1627, Corsair fleets had raided Iceland, capturing hundreds of prisoners from a country that sits just below the Arctic Circle. Pirates from North Africa sailing all the way to Iceland. The Xebec made that possible. Its speed, its ability to sail close to the wind on the open Atlantic, and its relatively modest crew requirements compared to a galley meant the Corsairs could project terror across thousands of miles of ocean. English coastal towns like Penzance were also hit. In 1640, Algerian Corsairs raided Penzance and enslaved 60 men, women, and children. Nowhere near salt water was truly safe. The European response to all of this was uneven at best. The Knights of Malta fought the Corsairs with their own galley fleet and scored some impressive victories, including withstanding the Great Siege of Malta in 1565, when the combined might of the Ottoman fleet and its Corsair auxiliaries could not break through. Various European nations sent punitive expeditions that would bombard a Corsair port, extract a treaty, and then sail home only for the piracy to resume within a year or two. In 1655, the English Admiral Blake led a fleet of 24 ships against Barbary positions, but even that show of force only brought temporary peace. The reality was that fighting the Corsairs was expensive and logistically exhausting, and many European governments found it cheaper to just pay tribute, protection money, basically. Hand over enough gold, silver, and military supplies every year, and the Corsairs would leave your ships alone. For a while, anyway. And the tribute payments were not small. Nations were shelling out fortunes annually just to keep their trade routes open. It was one of the most successful extortion operations in history, and it ran for centuries without anyone being able to shut it down permanently. This system worked until it did not. And the moment it truly broke down involved a brand new country that had never dealt with the Barbary pirates before, the United States of America. Before American independence, colonial merchant ships were protected by the British Royal Navy. The moment that protection disappeared after the Revolutionary War, American ships in the Mediterranean became easy targets. By 1795, the United States was paying nearly $1 million a year in tribute to the Barbary states. That was roughly 20% of the entire national budget going straight to pirates just to keep American sailors out of chains. The situation came to a head in 1801 when the Pasha of Tripoli, a man named Yusuf Karamanli, demanded even more money and declared war on the United States. His men literally chopped down the flagpole in front of the American consulate, which was the traditional way of declaring war in that part of the world. President Thomas Jefferson, who had been arguing for years that building a navy was smarter than paying tribute, sent American warships into the Mediterranean. This kicked off what became known as the First Barbary War. The very first action of the war showed what the Americans were up against. In August of 1801, Lieutenant Andrew Sterrett, in command of the 12-gun schooner Enterprise, fought a 3-hour battle against the 14-gun Tripolitan Corsair vessel Tripoli. The Americans won decisively, killing 30 of the Corsair crew and wounding another 30 without losing a single man. When the defeated Corsair captain Rais Mahomet Rouse returned to Tripoli, the Pasha was so furious that he ordered him to ride backward through the streets on a donkey and then gave him 500 lashes on his feet and backside. That is not a joke. That actually happened. But one of the most dramatic moments of the war involved a xebec directly. In 1803, the American frigate USS Philadelphia, a 36-gun warship, was chasing a Corsair xebec into the harbor of Tripoli. The xebec captain knew those shallow waters like the back of his hand. The American captain, William Bainbridge, did not. The Philadelphia ran hard aground on an uncharted reef, and no matter how much weight the crew threw overboard, guns, supplies, equipment, even the anchors, the ship would not budge. Corsair gunboats swarmed in from every direction. The crew was captured, over 300 American sailors enslaved, and now the pirates had a 36-gun American frigate sitting in their harbor, ready to be turned against the very navy that had sent it. To prevent the Philadelphia from being used against them, the Americans launched one of the most daring raids in naval history. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur led a small team of volunteers into Tripoli harbor at night, disguised on a captured local vessel called the Intrepid. They crept alongside the Philadelphia, boarded her, overwhelmed the Corsair guards in hand-to-hand combat, set the massive frigate ablaze, and escaped in their small boat while Tripolitan shore batteries fired blindly into the darkness. The British Admiral Horatio Nelson reportedly called it the most bold and daring act of the age. But the fact remained that a Corsair xebec had lured a 36-gun American warship to its destruction by exploiting the shallow coastal waters that only a xebec captain would know how to navigate. That is how effective these ships and their crews were, even against a modern, well-armed navy. The other great xebec story from this era is the one we started with, the capture of El Gamo by HMS Speedy. On the morning of May 6, 1801, Thomas Cochrane spotted the Spanish El Gamo off Barcelona. El Gamo was a beast, 32 guns, including 22 12-pounders and 2 24-pounder carronades, 319 men aboard. She displaced about 600 tons. The Speedy, by comparison, had 14 tiny 4-pounder guns, 54 men, and was so small it barely qualified as a warship. Cochrane knew he could not win a conventional fight, so he did not fight conventionally. He raised an American flag to buy time as he closed the distance, a common ruse in that era. When the Gamo fired a warning shot and raised Spanish colors, Cochrane hauled down the fake flag and raised the British ensign. Then he did something that no rational captain would attempt. He ran the tiny Speedy directly alongside the massive xebec frigate, so close that the hulls were practically touching. At that range, the Spanish guns could not depress low enough to hit him. The cannonballs simply flew over the Speedy's deck and splashed harmlessly into the sea on the other side. Meanwhile, Cochrane's guns were in the perfect position to fire upward through the Gamo's hull, and he loaded them with triple shot to maximize the damage. For over an hour, the two ships hammered each other at point-blank range. The Spanish tried to board the Speedy 3 separate times, but each time Cochrane briefly pulled away and fired into the massed boarding parties, cutting them down before they could cross. After softening the enemy crew, Cochrane ordered his entire remaining force to board. 54 men against 319. His sailors smeared their faces with gunpowder and grease to look as terrifying as possible in the smoke and chaos. The sight of these wild-looking, blackened borders pouring over the rail apparently shocked the Spanish crew so badly that many of them froze in place. The Spanish captain, Don Francisco de Torres, had already been killed by gunfire earlier in the fight, and without clear leadership from their officers, the organized resistance collapsed within minutes. Cochrane captured the Xebec frigate with just 3 of his men killed and 9 wounded. The Spanish lost 14 dead and 41 wounded, with the remaining 261 taken prisoner. It remains one of the most lopsided single-ship victories in naval history, and the ship Cochrane captured, El Gamo, was eventually sold to the ruler of Algiers, where it ended up as a merchant vessel. Even in defeat, the Xebec found its way back to North Africa. But the age of the Xebec was winding down. By the early 1800s, European navies were adapting. Several Mediterranean powers had already started building their own Xebecs, copying the Corsair designs to use against them. The French Navy launched at least 9 Xebecs between 1750 and 1759, specifically to counter the Barbary threat. Spain used Xebec frigates extensively in its Mediterranean operations. These European versions sometimes replaced the lateen sails on one or more masts with square rigging, creating hybrid vessels called Polarkerg Xebecs that combined the best qualities of both traditions. The final blow to the Xebec era came through sheer military force applied again and again until there was nothing left to fight. The First Barbary War ended in 1805 with a treaty after American Marines and a force of mercenaries marched across the Egyptian desert and captured the Tripolitan city of Derna in one of the most improbable military operations of the era. That battle is the reason the Marine Corps hymn still references the shores of Tripoli. But the treaty did not solve the problem permanently. Corsair raids resumed once American attention turned elsewhere. The Second Barbary War in 1815 saw the American Commodore Stephen Decatur, the same man who had burned the Philadelphia 12 years earlier, return to the Mediterranean with a squadron of warships. Off Cape Gata, near the Spanish coast, Decatur's forces caught the Algerian flagship and killed the legendary Corsair captain Reis Hamidou during the battle. With their best commander dead and their fleet outgunned, Algiers was forced to sign a humiliating treaty, ending tribute payments to the United States for good. Then, in 1816, a combined British and Dutch fleet, under Admiral Edward Pellew, bombarded Algiers in one of the most ferocious naval engagements since Trafalgar. The Allied fleet opened fire at close range and pounded the Algerian harbour defences for hours. By the time it was over, the fleet had destroyed or captured dozens of Corsair vessels, including 4 frigates, 5 corvettes, and 28 gunboats. More than 3,000 European captives were freed from the slave markets. Casualties on the Allied side were 900 dead and wounded, and the fighting was considered more savage than Trafalgar itself. The Dey of Algiers was forced to abolish slavery and piracy practices, at least officially, but even that was not the final chapter. Corsair activity based in Algiers continued on a smaller scale. European powers discussed further action at the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1818. In 1824, the British had to threaten to bombard Algiers again before the earlier treaty was renewed. The piracy only truly ended in 1830, when France invaded Algeria outright and conquered the territory. With Algiers under French control, the centuries-long era of Barbary Corsair raids was finally over. And with it, the Xebec faded into history. The ship that had made all of it possible, the raids, the slave trade, the tribute payments, the international conflicts, quietly disappeared as steam power replaced sail and iron hulls replaced wood. The last Xebecs in European naval service had already been converted to full square rig, becoming Xebec frigates that bore little resemblance to the sleek, lateen-sailed predators that had once haunted every shipping lane from Gibraltar to the Aegean. But the legacy of the Xebec runs deeper than you might expect. The Barbary Wars were a defining moment for the early United States Navy. The Marine Corps hymn still references the shores of Tripoli because of the 1805 Battle of Derna, where American Marines and a ragtag force of mercenaries marched across the desert from Egypt to capture a Tripolitan city. That entire war happened because Corsairs in Xebec would not stop attacking American ships. The narrow streets of 100 Mediterranean villages still echo the fear of Corsair raids. The massive coastal watchtowers that dot the shorelines of Italy, Spain, and southern France were built specifically to spot approaching Xebec and sound the alarm. For 3 centuries, the sight of those distinctive lateen sails on the horizon meant one thing to anyone living near the coast: run, hide, or be taken. The Xebec was never the biggest ship on the water. It was never the toughest. A proper line of battleship could destroy one without breaking a sweat. But that was never the point. The Xebec was built for a very specific kind of warfare: fast strikes, quick escapes, and the ability to go places that bigger ships simply could not follow. It was the ultimate asymmetric weapon, a ship designed not to win wars, but to win every individual encounter through speed, surprise, and the sheer terror of 400 armed men coming over your railing before you could load a cannon. In a world where everyone remembers the Caribbean pirates, the galleons, the Black Pearl, it is worth remembering that the most prolific, most successful, and longest-lasting pirate tradition in history operated on the other side of the Atlantic. And the ship that made it all possible was a sleek, shallow, drafted, lateen-rigged predator that could outrun anything it could not outfight, and outfight almost anything it could catch. That was the Xebec, the razor-sharp raider of the Mediterranean. If you found this story as wild as we did, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us which pirate ship you think was the deadliest of all time. And if you enjoyed this one, smash the like button so we know to bring you more deep dives like this.